Hi, this is Aaron with Vanishing Cabinets, and in this video I'm going to be building 4 picture frames for some wrap canvas paintings, while also testing different joineries for the miter joints, and at the end I'll talk about my thoughts and my favorite out of the 4, so get cozy and enjoy the show. Here is the wall now. Let's see. I don't think we'll quite need this much. Maybe this one. Picture frames are one of those builds that are always trickier than they should be for me, and I think it's mainly about getting the miter joints and the corners to look good. I have 4 pictures I want to frame here, including 1 for a friend of mine and 3 for my own house, and I figured it'd be a good opportunity to try out a few different joineries and see which one I like the most personally. For this first one, I'm just using a dado stack on my table saw to carve out a groove in the middle of the boards for the picture to sit in. It will cover a bit of the edges of the picture, but I think it'll be a nice clean look and give the frame kind of an inset look. I'm not too sure if this is the traditional way to make a frame like this, but the groove actually came out pretty good. What's also nice about this method is you have a bit of wiggle room, since there's that front lip hiding any inconsistencies in the spacing of the frame. For the oak frame, you can see that there's really not a lot of surface area to glue up. I'm going to reinforce the joint with some pins using a pin nailer and just do my best to line it up by hand. Probably also going to tape the joint. I might use these little miter pincher things. This first picture is a bit smaller as compared to the other 3 I'm going to be doing, so I decided to use a butt joint, which is basically just butting the boards together and gluing. With picture frames in particular, tape is definitely your friend here. It really helps to hold the boards in place and keep them aligned during the assembly. And I'm also going overkill here. I'm using miter clamps and pin nails to hold the joint in place while the glue dries. Honestly, the tape would probably be just fine on its own, but I didn't want to take any chances. Because the picture is going to be sitting in the middle groove of that frame, I had to join 3 boards together initially and then slide the picture in prior to adding the final 4th board. Little note on the pins, I made sure to fire them on the top and bottom boards instead of on the sides, just to lower the chance of them being seen. And after I got the clamps on this final corner, this one was done and ready to get to work on the next ones. About 10 years ago, I officially became an adult and started decorating my house, and I really got into these nature pictures. I pretty much got them all online, and one thing that quickly became clear is that these retailers really gouge the crap out of you on the frame cost. So I just got used to the frameless look for pretty much all the art in my house. Hey, nothing wrong with that, but now I finally have the means to build my own frames. For this second one, I'm building the frame out of pine, and this one is going to be a float mount, meaning there'll be a small gap between the picture and the frame all the way around. And to do this, I needed to add a backer strip on the inside edge of the frame to give me something to nail the picture to. Much of the decor in my house has black trim of some type, so 2 of the 3 of the frames going in my house I'm going to be staining black. From an order of operations standpoint, probably not my best move to stain these prior to assembly, and also not the best idea to mount the backer strips in at this point, and that will become clear later as to why these were premature. On this one, I'm going to be trying something I have never tried before, and that is adding vertical splines in the miter joints. Basically, I'm going to be using these splines to help both with the alignment of the joint and also for additional strength. The best way I could think to cut the notches for these was using my miter saw. So I tilted it at 45 degrees with a depth stop and then used a spacer board to make sure that the blade cut all the way through at the full depth. I cut the splines out of maple, and I'm going with maple because I'm looking for a contrasting wood look. When it came to the actual assembly and joining, it was actually pretty straightforward. Much of the precision was reliant on the upstream cutting of the grooves and making sure that those cuts were consistent, the right depth and all that, and in the same spot. Oh, and also the size of the spline was important to make sure that it had a nice snug fit. Again, here for the clamping package, I'm going with a combination of tape, pins, and miter clamps. There are so many miter clamp options out there, and they all seem to be pretty terrible. Seriously, leave me a comment as to the best way to clamp down a miter joint, because I'll try anything at this point. For some reason I thought it would be cool to hammer in one of the splines after the glue up, and didn't quite go as planned. There were some very small gaps that I went ahead and filled with some wood filler, thus highlighting that I needed to sand anyway and sanded off a lot of the stain, so I did have to restain. And I did mention that I wanted the spline to be visible, so I carefully avoided staining those, and with that, this one was all done. For the third frame, I am using the same pine as the one before, also stained black with the plywood backing strips. For the joinery, I'm going to be using this Festool Domino, which is basically an overpriced tool that cuts holes for fancy little pieces of wood that will sit in between the joint to help with alignment and strength. I mentioned earlier that I was a little premature in adding those backing strips, and that's because I needed a flat surface to be able to mount this tool properly and drill out the holes. So I ended up having to cut back a little of that strip to leave enough space to mount the tool. I cut 2 mortises in each joint using some spacer blocks to make sure that I got consistent placement for all the holes, which really is the most critical part of this whole process. Anytime you can use some kind of spacing block or a jig for repeatable cuts, it's really the best way to go over measuring and marking, since it takes a lot of the thinking and human error out of the process. Similar to the splines, the assembly here really is quite straightforward, so long as the work done upstream was done properly. There's definitely something really satisfying about watching work pieces come together with mortise and tenon joinery. Almost like putting pieces of a puzzle together. It's really satisfying.
Yeah, perfect. Easy.
For the fourth and final frame, I'm going to be making this one out of maple. Like the others, I cut out a rabbet to fit the backing strip for the float mount. Quick note on the table saw setup here, I'm using a feather board to keep the board into the fence and clamp some plywood to the fence to keep the board down, both of which really help to get consistent grooves. I picked up these miter joint router bits from Amazon, which I'll leave a link in the description too. And these basically cut the 45-degree cut in the end of the boards while routing out a tongue and groove type profile to help align the joints. Essentially you need to run one end flat against the bit and then run the joining board vertically against the fence. And in theory they should make complementary edge profiles that will join to make a perfect miter joint. The problem is, it's really hard to run these narrow boards along the fence without getting a ton of tear out. So I had to get creative and run the 2 boards together at the same time using some clamps, really just to add some volume and stability while making the pass along the bit. This actually ended up working out pretty decent, got a little bit of burn but wasn't too bad.
Why are you sliding around, asshole?
I wised up and also clamped a board parallel to the table that I could use as a support along the fence while making the next pass. If it wasn't already clear, I made the same mistake twice where I prematurely nailed in the backing strips that I ended up having to hammer off so I could do the routing steps. But here we are now doing the glue up, and I'm just doing my best to line up the edge profiles, just clamping, taping, and nailing to hold everything together. If you haven't ever tried this, using some sawdust and glue really makes for a great makeshift wood filler, and it's pretty convenient to throw some in there right at the glue up so when you sand later you don't see any of those gaps in the joint.
Oh, pretty horrible.
I swear I spent hours dialing in that router stuff, just doing a bunch of test pieces to make sure everything was going to line up. But as a wise man once said, the difference between a craftsman and a woodworker is a craftsman knows how to hide his mistakes. I wasn't quite done with this frame. I also wanted to add a couple horizontal splines in the miters. For one, to add strength to the joint, and 2, just to give the frame a more interesting look with some contrasting wood in there. To cut out the gaps for the splines, I made a jig out of plywood. So first I made a snug 3-board cover around the table saw fence, and then I screwed a vertical board into that which has 2 45-degree angled shelves that would support the workpiece. I really ended up using only one side of the jig and just clamped the frame for each pass. And I took 2 passes for each notch and made 2 notches per corner. And the jig worked beautifully. I think these splines ended up being about a 1/4 inch wide, and I cut them out of some scrap walnut. And this was my first time doing these horizontal splines, and honestly, it went pretty smoothly, which again, I attribute all to the table saw jig I made earlier. For years, I resisted making jigs, thinking I wasn't a jig guy. Can't say I know why for sure, maybe it's the hipster in me, but now I've come to see the error of my ways, and I am drinking the Kool-Aid officially. And after some light sanding, these frames were completely built. For the two that I didn't end up staining, I needed to apply some finish prior to mounting in the pictures. And I'm going with Rubio Monocoat, which is an oil-based finish that provides great protection and really warms up the color and the wood grain. I like maple in general because of the lighter color, but I mean, walnut really is a beautiful wood after you get some finish on there. And the very last step here was to mount the pictures into their frames, and I'm using 18 gauge brad nails, shooting them through the backing strip into the frame of the canvas, which should be plenty strong, and leaving that consistent gap around all the edges gives it that floating look. I decided to add some 1/4 inch plywood sheets to cover up those gaps left over after I cut back some of the backing strip. Probably not necessary, but I didn't want any gaps to be visible through the reveal.
Alright, here are my final thoughts on the different joineries, starting with the butt joinery. The pros, it's fast, it's easy, and you don't really need any tools. On the con side, I would say that the joint is weak, so it's at risk of separating over time, and it could potentially be a little tricky to line them up since there's nothing like tangible to hold things in place. In the case of this walnut one, I did use pins to help with that, but if you weren't using pins, there's definitely a risk of the joint coming apart over time, especially for a bigger picture. Moving on to the one with the vertical splines. I had a lot of fun building this one. I think on the pros side, I think it looks really cool. It's more of a preference thing, but I like having that spline visible. And it's also going to be a pretty strong joint having that bonding spline in there. And the spline also really helps with the alignment to hold things in place when you're gluing it up. On the con side, I would say it's challenging, especially to make the cuts the way I did with the miter saw. So it's time consuming and it's a pretty high level of precision. If things were off by even a little bit, the joint really didn't come together that nice. So definitely high level of effort here. Moving on to the one made with the domino, I would say pros are that it was fast, it was consistent, and the joint came out very nice, clean, and aligned. As far as cons for this, there's really only one main con, and that is the price of the tool. And obviously that's a major con, and I could definitely see that ruling out this as a possibility for a lot of people. For the maple one, I'm going to break it down into two different types of joinery. So I'll first start with the one with the router tongue and groove. The pros of this, I would say you have some assistance with the alignment, having it something tangible for them to match up. I would say it looks kind of cool, it looks unique seeing that tongue and groove on the profile if you like that look. On the con side, I would say that the router setup is challenging and it takes a lot of time to dial in. And I definitely have problems with tear out and things like that that come with using a router. Next I'll talk about the horizontal splines that I had in that maple one as well. Pros are I think it looks really great and the joint is going to be very strong. On the cons I would say it's time consuming, so time to cut out splines, cut up the notches for the splines, make a jig if you're going to make one. And this one I also say it's a challenge, like a high level of precision to make sure the splines look nice and aligned and all that.
But I don't know how much I like that frame against a white wall.
So just to summarize, for me, the domino is the fastest and the most efficient. My favorite though is the one with the horizontal splines because I really like the look of it. And I would prioritize how something looks over how fast I can make it. My least favorite, hands down, was the router. I could see there being some use for this for things with wider edges, like a box or something like that. But for a picture frame, it just didn't really seem to be the best way to go. The vertical spline one looked pretty cool and it was fun to do, but I think I prefer the horizontal splines. As for just the typical butt joint, I probably use this for some smaller ones, but if I'm making a frame for a big picture, I'd rather put some more effort into it to make sure that that joint's not going to come apart over time. But all that being said, I would love to hear from you guys. Let me know what your favorite miter joint is, or just let me know if you agree or disagree with the ones I've gone through here. I'm definitely still just learning this stuff for myself, so I'd love to get some more wisdom from you guys. But that's going to wrap it up for this video. Thank you so much for watching. And if you haven't done so already, please consider subscribing and liking the video, and I'll see you on the next one.